Okay, Hang On Aaron is live. Welcome to the Change My View podcast. I'm Michael Hatch, and joining us today is John, whose post from 29 days ago just passed over 9,000 upvotes on Reddit. And what that means is it was definitely on the front page, and it's on the topic of abortion. So it was just a very interesting, very deep thread. A lot of heat there, obviously, because of the topic, but within the bounds of Change My View. So, John, thank you for joining us today.
Oh, no problem.
And before we get started, would you mind just telling us your username and then reading the name of your post, please?
All right, so I'm JT Foster 2 on Reddit, and the post I made was if Republicans do not support either abortion or birth control, then they should be supporting social programs to help families raise their children.
Great. Okay. And so just to get us started, could you just tell us a little about yourself, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, I'm currently a sophomore in college right now, studying computer science. Pretty avid gamer, but I also do like to keep up on the news and all. And there wasn't like a specific thing that wanted me or that made me go, "Oh, I need to talk about this right now." But after just hearing everybody talk about it over the past couple months, I felt like, "Hey, this is something I want to give my opinion on." And this specific topic, it was something that I sort of saw as like a double entendre, I guess. And I was like, "This seems like a weird thing, and I want to ask people why they would support it if there's these two other things that conflict with it."
Copy that. And so when before you posted this post, like a lot of times, an OP we have on will have something have happened personally to them, like the double parking example I usually go to is like, well, someone double parked and they couldn't park, and now they're putting a post up saying double parking should be capital punishment, right? Like it's something in their life connected to it. Would you tell us sort of maybe what initiated things for you in this one? Because I think you as you were saying before, have a bit of a different answer. So.
Well, I didn't, like I was saying, I didn't have like one thing that necessarily happened to make me need to talk about it necessarily. I'm kind of active on the Change My View subreddit. I've made a couple of posts on the site before, and there's always some like interesting topics that I throw up there to see what people think of. And there's just like one idea sort of came to me, and I sort of spitballed it with a friend of mine, just sort of see where things were. And as we were going on about it, it's like, hey, this is actually a pretty deep argument. I kind of wonder what other people would have to say about it. So I figured this would be a good place to post it and see what other people thought. And apparently a lot of people had thoughts to post on it.
Great. And yeah, you have struck clearly a chord with a lot of people joining it. And it's been a perennial topic in the discussion of abortion that I think I haven't really seen a fully thorough exploration of. So I mean, I just think, one of the great things I like about Change My View is that if there's a topic I'm not sure about, I can find a post from 3 years ago with like 800 comments on it and be like, oh, okay, we can drill down to like what some of the strongest comments are, especially the ones that generated deltas. So, this will, serve for a long time for people to be able to go and see, the different citations and everything. So just another resource that Change My View can become. So I recommend anyone that, like this, many other topics have great places you can go to in the past that have also served to give both sides of an issue and some pretty reasoned discussion that you can sort of feel out and see what fits for you. So, but with that aside, I just wanted to know if you had anything else you wanted to say about your previous experience with Change My View as a subreddit, or any other, just briefly, discussions you had started that you thought were cool to talk about.
Oh, well, this is the first one that I had like blow up so much, but there was like a couple of others that I had that I've spitballed in the past. Like, the first one I had posted on there was primary schools in the U.S. should be trying to teach Spanish alongside English education. And like another one that was a bit more popular, but not nearly as much, was the franking privilege that U.S. congressmen enjoy should be extended to their opponents during elections. And that was a couple of months ago, but during the Fresh Topic Friday. But it was something that had come up when I'd gotten some correspondence from my congressman with the election that was coming up a few months ago, and I wanted to spitball that.
Nice. Okay, and so the franking privilege, would you mind explaining that just briefly for anyone listening?
So basically, there's a little bit of nuance to it, but the quick explanation for it is basically the U.S. Postal Service from what I understand, they don't have to have a stamp on there when they're mailing out correspondence to constituents. Um, so they don't have to pay anything for it, and it's great for congressmen who tend to send a lot of correspondence to their constituents.
Mm-hmm.
And so when it normally costs somebody like a good bit of money to send out a letter to people who might be voting in the next election, the incumbent in office can send out a message for little to no cost to them themselves, and the
Right.
post office, and by extension, the electorate has to pay for that.
So you think that's essentially making an unfair advantage for the incumbent, and you feel like it should be extended to the pool of candidates?
Yeah, there were like some people that were saying that the drinking privilege just needs to be erased altogether, but I want to take in the opposite direction and say, hey, instead of getting rid of it, maybe everybody who's running for election should be able to use that ability. And that sort of ties into like some other election reform stuff that I've seen people talk about on CMV before.
Right on. Okay, cool. Well, that just gives kind of a flavor of your activity and obviously being an active participant. And anything else in the big picture of Change My View that you'd want to talk about, or do you want to just get right into the rest of the post?
The first post that actually like got me in to Change My View, and the thing that really amazed me was there was just one post where it's the thing that got me in. It was, I'm trying to remember because it's been deleted a little bit ago, but it was like, if you can't accept the fact that your child might grow up to be gay, you shouldn't have children. And it was one of those that blew up a lot.
Woo.
I don't think it made it to the top all time, but it was definitely a very heated one that blew up. And I was talking to my friend about it, and afterwards I started going back and looking at more of the posts on CMV, and it's like, hey, I really like this place. I wanted to, sort of like what you were talking about, people can go there to get information on stuff or throw their own 2 cents in, and I wanted to be a part of that.
All right, right on. Okay, well, then we'll get right into your post now here, and if you wouldn't mind, then just one more time saying your username and reading the title, and then we'll pause for a bit, and then we'll read the rest of the post.
All right. So again, username is JTFoster2, and my post was if Republicans do not support abortion or birth control, they should be supporting social programs to help families raise their children.
Great. And I think, let's just go into it. If you wouldn't mind in your own voice, reading the post, and then later on, if we look at a couple of back and forths and deltas, I'll do the other voices that aren't you. But for now, if you wouldn't mind just reading through that, and but leaving out the edit for now, and then we'll touch on the edit after.
All right. So at the time, I knew that like the topics of abortion and birth control were really sensitive topics that people would like to discuss, and that's one of the things I know on CMV. I was actually flagged at the beginning because I was told that this is a common thing. You might want to go back and look to see what other people have said about this before. But the main issue I saw with those is like people were like, is it moral? Is it not moral? All this other stuff. But the main issue I was seeing with them is with these topics, it's really more about what women should be allowed to do if they cannot care for a child that may come about from having intercourse of some type with someone. And like I had mentioned, in politics, as the issues come up, Republicans seem to come to the conclusion that the two are immoral or a form of murder. And those are the most common arguments I've seen, but there's also other variations. And by themselves, I can kind of understand the arguments, but the understanding, I can understand wanting to give babies a chance at life, but I also sort of saw it as a contradiction between that conservatives would have with those two arguments, because fundamentally, if you're talking about like economic conservatives, they don't support social welfare programs, but that opposition doesn't include supporting initiatives to help families care for children. And there's many different programs different countries have done, even the United States, like maternity leave, healthcare reform, birth control, centered around birth care, subsidies for child rearing, and other forms of government assistance. But I've also seen like there's been opposition, not nearly as much as there is like public stuff, but there's also been some sort of opposition towards private attempts to help with these issues. Like Planned Parenthood was the first thing I was thinking of because that comes up in the news a lot. But basically, a short and sweet version of it is I know conservatives don't support birth control or abortion for the most part, but they also refuse to cover the costs of like the children that can arise from lack of access to those things. It's even if the families can't afford those children that they have to have.
Great. Okay, so that roughly summarizes there the post content. And so when you were coming into this, like many OPs, there's a gap. There's something in you that's saying I might not have the right opinion, right? So what was it that perhaps before you even came in was an inkling of where you might have something wrong?
It was probably my point on birth control, because I know like abortion is the big topic that everybody talks about, and I had heard like some stuff in the past about conservatives like not being in favor of birth control and all. And from what I understand, like legislation in the past with abortion and all that also kind of ties into birth control. And a lot of people talk about Roe v. Wade, and wanting to overturn that, but I believe there was also another Supreme Court case that involved that. The mind's slipping me, but I thought all those kind of points would point to them also being against birth control, but I wasn't 100% solid on that.
Gotcha. Okay. So I think a good place to start might be just to look at the delta that you did give away. But before we do that, if you wouldn't mind just reading the edit that you added to this and sort of explaining a little bit about why that came up and why it's important.
Yeah, so the edit I threw in, I was saying that it was coming up a lot in the comments below, but the point I was trying to make, and I was doing this sort of a clarification. I was saying that Republicans are generally against interfering with what a person does in their life, but they seem to violate that in restriction to abortion. So what I'm saying is that if they're willing to interfere in someone's life because of that, they should be willing to go against another one of their values in order to help cover the costs associated with that prevention. So basically, I was saying that like in a general sort of sense, Republicans are all about like personal liberty and stuff, but also against like high government costs and the government interfering in people's lives and all. And the argument I was trying to make, and I was using that edit to try to clear it up, is since the Republicans are basically trying to have the government intrude into people's lives to prevent them from having access to abortion or birth control, then they should also be willing to have that government support them in raising children, since that government also wants to prevent them from getting rid of that child they might not be able to care for.
Copy that. Okay, cool. So with that clarification, then let's just jump right ahead. And so what we have here, just for those listening who can't see the thread in front of them, the top comment in reply and that gave the that delta, let's just open this up, is from a user named Kevin Wester is the username. And so this is one of the higher comments with, let's get the parent comments going here to make sure. And okay, so Kevin Wester's comment is 1.4 or 1,400 upvotes. And then from there, we have a back and forth essentially 4 times that leads to a delta. So what we're going to do here is I'm going to read anything by Kevin Wester's posts, and then you know, obviously you'll do yours in your own voice. And you know, we have the awkward part here where these posts will often quote each other, but just for simplicity, I'm still going to use my voice when quoting you within Kevin's posts. So hopefully that'll make sense. And then let's just do a little back and forth here and just get to that delta, and then we'll discuss. Cool.
All right.
Great. So I'll open up. And this is Kevin Wester quoting you at this top comment. And he says, and he's quoting you, quote, "Republicans have seemed to come to the conclusion that birth control and abortion are either immoral or a form of murder. Parentheses, I'm stating both because these are the most common arguments I see," unquote. And so that's the end of the quote for you. Then Kevin writes, "I think it's fair to say that a lot of Republicans are pro-life, but I want to note that," and this is in bold, "most," unbold, "rational people support birth control. I think it's really only the fringe on the right that say no to a condom or birth control, or whatever." So, and then he quotes you again, and this is another comment of yours he'll been responding to. Kevin Wester quoting you, saying, quote, "But also refuse to help cover the costs of children that result from the lack of access to these, even when families cannot afford the children they are essentially forced to have," unquote. Now Kevin's voice again. Kevin saying, "Well, I think pro-life people truly believe that killing a baby when it's inside a womb is no different from murdering a person on the street. And although I'm more pro-choice, I can't understand how someone might feel a moral obligation to prevent this from occurring, just as someone might step in to prevent a husband from stabbing his wife, etc. And say you bravely prevent that wife from being stabbed or killed as an act of moral duty. Are you now on the hook to make sure the wife has a comfortable life because you saved her from dying? I don't think you necessarily are." Again, I think that's how pro-life people approach this whole thing. They're simply stepping in to prevent a murder from occurring because they believe it's their duty to protect those who can't protect themselves. Right or wrong, I can understand how this is a rational and logical viewpoint. And that's the end of Kevin Wester's comment.
Alright, and I responded to him by saying I wasn't necessarily saying that women who have children that they can't care for be totally cared for by the state, but I don't think they necessarily should. I do think the government should be helping with some of the costs associated with that child rearing, and you can sort of see this in some places with things like WIC, which helps provide nutritious food for families with children and other things.
And what does WIC stand for? You know,
Women, infant, and children.
There you go. Okay, cool. And then, so here is Kevin Wester's reply. And he's quoting you essentially the whole thing you just said, so I won't repeat it. And in response, he says, "Right, but this is an entirely different conversation from abortion. Is the point I'm essentially, which is the point he's essentially, Kevin, preventing the quote unquote murder of the unborn is one issue, while universal or publicly funded healthcare is another. Do you get my point?"
Yeah, and I said abortion isn't the sole issue I'm raising either, and this is basically a clarification. What I am saying is if someone can't support a child that they have growing in the womb but cannot get an abortion, then Republicans have a moral obligation to help care for that child. It seems they go by, we care about an unborn child, but when it finally comes out, it's all on you to care for it.
All right, and Kevin Wester's response here is, "I disagree with this. Let's say Steve and Tony are reckless and end up getting pregnant with a child they can't afford. Are our only two options, one, kill the baby, or two, everyone else in society now needs to support Steve, Tony, and the child? I think there's some middle ground here." Next paragraph. "Also, we have a solid system of safety nets set up in this country already, and no hospital is going to refuse service to someone who needs it. To my understanding, I don't think Republicans want to change this, right? I almost feel like this is being framed up that the majority of mainstream Republicans will be okay with a baby starving or a mom having to give birth in the street or something. I just don't think this is the case." And that's the end of Kevin Wester's comment. So we have to scroll down a list because there's a higher voted thing that gets in the way of this this continuation. So I'm just going down now to what would be the response by you, and go for it.
All right, so I cited him when he said that the parents made a poor decision by creating a living human baby, and I responded by saying, what would you say then to like a victim of rape, for instance? They didn't necessarily make the decision to have that baby, but they still have to deal with it. And there's also other situations where family that uses birth control to try to prevent it, but conception still happens. And another thing I had quoted him on was also we need to have a solid system of safety nets in this country already, and no hospital is going to refuse service to someone who needs it. To my understanding, I don't think Republicans want to change this, right? And I said, to my understanding, that was one of the controversial things until Obamacare, where hospitals could refuse care to people who couldn't afford it, or for stuff that someone's insurance wouldn't cover. And again, like from what I understand, that changed with the Affordable Care Act, as people were required to have health insurance, and insurance companies can refuse to cover something.
Copy that. And there was just one clarification I wanted to make, I think, just on Kevin's point there. I think he was saying that we currently have a solid system rather than need to, I think, but just to make sure that was clear. But yeah, that's fine. It's just it's hard to read and talk at the same time of this, I know. But okay, so then to what you're just saying, here's Kevin's response, and after that we'll follow with your comment, which had the delta, and then we can talk about that more loosely. So here's Kevin's comment. Quoting you, what would you say about a victim of rape? They didn't make the decision to have that baby, but they still have to deal with it. And then Kevin says, well, we're talking about an anomaly of less than 0.2% of all pregnancies. So would argue that this isn't a good way to approach the general argument. But to answer your question, I'm not strict pro-life and feel a woman should have a right to abort. And from a pro-life standpoint, in these extremely rare cases, I feel like Christians or whoever should support having all adoption costs waived and or additional welfare benefits. Kevin Wester quoting you now again here. He says, there is also the other situation where a family uses birth control to try and prevent it, but conception still happens, unquote. And now Kevin speaking again. Right, there's risks to having sex that everyone knows going into it. And I will say that if you are literally in a position where if you create a baby, you and the baby will literally be starving out in the cold because you're so poor, you should probably take this into serious consideration before having casual sex for pleasure. Second, I think if you combine two methods together, condom plus birth control or condom plus withdrawal, the chance of pregnancy is nearly 0%. Again, quoting you, he's quoting you to say, quote, to my understanding, that was one of the controversial things until Obamacare, where hospitals could refuse care to people who couldn't afford it, or for stuff that someone else's insurance wouldn't cover. And now Kevin finally says, I'm not an expert by any means, but I feel you'd be hard pressed to find any cases of a hospital in the USA refusing to deliver a baby because someone has no insurance, or refusing to operate on a gunshot patient because they have no insurance. Again, if you have examples of this occurring in any regular or meaningful way, I'd love to take a look. And that's the end of Kevin's comment.
All right, and then I responded by quoting him, right, there's risks to having sex that everybody knows going into it. I will say that if you're literally in a position where if you create a baby and you and the baby will be starving out in the cold because you're so poor, you should probably take this into serious consideration before having casual sex for pleasure. And I gave him the delta, and my justification was, all right, I think you've done enough to warrant that. I was making the whole argument on the assumption that the costs of childbearing are really expensive, but that's also assuming like a lot of other factors. It wouldn't necessarily bankrupt people unless they're really close to the poverty line, and you make a good point with that.
Okay, great. So to step away from the actual text now, do you have any just general thoughts on that thread as a whole?
Well, yeah, actually, if you go down a bit from it, that was actually one of the things that kind of surprised me, was I actually had it kind of reverse back onto me, and I had like a lot of people that were saying that, like, no, I don't think you should have given this delta, and they started giving a lot of things to the contrary as well that I thought was interesting.
Oh, okay, yeah. So you gave the delta, and then they're saying like, no, you shouldn't have done that. Here's why.
Yeah, and they were giving a lot of stuff that would have supported my argument.
Okay, well, if you wouldn't mind, maybe if you could point out one or two that you thought were interesting that I could read then as the other voice.
Well, there's one by BTTR dash SWT that is like right under me. That he also does a good like monetary analysis of things.
Okay, cool. So let me read that down, and this is the one that opens with the cost of giving birth.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is by user BTTR dash SWT, which I'm guessing is bittersweet, maybe. So we'll call it bittersweet for now, or bitter dash sweet. Actually, there's a dash in there. And then here goes. Here is their reason why they're telling you shouldn't have given a delta. The cost of giving birth is wholly dependent on each patient. I was 18 when I had my son. My due date came and went, and at 41 and a half weeks, my water finally broke at midnight in the middle of July. I was in labor for 13 hours before I conceded to getting an epidural. I was exhausted, hungry, and thirsty. I don't know if you're aware of this, but most hospitals advise against mothers to be eating or drinking very much food until after the baby is born. 24 hours after my water broke, I was still stuck at 5 centimeters because my son wasn't facing the right direction. My hips did not open wide enough during the course of my pregnancy, and he was bigger than expected because we were well past my due date. I had to have a C-section and stay in the hospital for 3 days instead of 2 so they could monitor my recovery. Because I was 18 and a full-time college student, I was still covered under my parents' health insurance plan. And thank God for that, because the bill for my entire hospital stay was almost $200,000. This was in 2008, and costs have only risen since then. None of this includes the costs and copays required for your OBGYN visits, consults with pediatricians. You must have one before you give birth, and the lab tests that you have to take. Last paragraph. Being pregnant and then having a child can be extremely costly. No hospital is going to turn you away if you're in labor, but you better pray you have some proper medical insurance and hope no surprises happen, because this bill is staggering.
Yeah. That was definitely kind of an interesting read when I came back to it. And that was definitely a really interesting personal take on it, since I don't have that kind of experience myself. And I was looking through some of the other comments that people left, and a majority of them were kind of going down to you can basically boil down the argument to they should know better, or it's their own fault, or some other sort of accusation, or other personal stories. There's this interesting one by Dolch Messer. It's two comments down from Bittersweet.
I
The
see it.
author does
Yeah.
another good explanation for.
Okay, cool. So then I'll go ahead and read Dolch Messer's, and we'll go from there. Buckle up; it's a little bit longer of a comment. So, first paragraph of 3 paragraphs. I find it curious you awarded a delta here. User Kevin Wester appears to propose that all humans are rational actors when we have substantial reasons to believe that that is not the case. Unwanted pregnancies are not the result of completely rational, sanely chosen circumstances, i.e., recklessness. They are the result of poor sex education, lack of access to birth control, lack of financial means to access birth control, and sometimes just poor judgments and accidents. And there's an asterisk there, which we'll get to when we jump to it. Continues, the majority of those circumstances can be ameliorated by your state programs if the voter base would allow, but they do not. I think that was your initial point, and I don't see how this response really changes that beyond, well, most Republican Christians aren't like that, unquote. But if you buy that argument, fine, but I personally find it flimsy without substantiation and with the current representatives in office. And then this is now the asterisk point is brought back, and this is right after they said, and sometimes poor judgment and accidents. Asterisk says, and if recklessness versus personal responsibility is the key argument, then I would expect to see more legislation passed emphasizing the role of educated decision-making and conception, up to and including improving that education in schools. But no Republican wants to touch that because sex is bad. That's the end of the asterisk. And finally, the last paragraph here, considering the asterisk one, the second paragraph. Final paragraph. As for your second component, the social support, I feel, at least in this thread, that the point has become diluted. Maybe the question was poorly posed from the outset. It's difficult to pinpoint the precise extent to which a person should be supported by the state, but let's touch on some of the ways that they can be let down other than outright bankrupting the family. If you assume the parents were reckless or disadvantaged to begin with, then you have a reckless or disadvantaged parent raising a child, which leads to a generally poor education, poor job opportunities as a result of poor education, and poor sex education because that's how they likely got there in the first place. And it hasn't changed, so now it's a cycle. Furthermore, the parents who could have been far more productive members of society now cannot aspire to or hold the jobs they might have otherwise because childcare is so poorly subsidized. Some parents pay as much in childcare as they do for a car if they can afford it or even rent. And yes, while emergency rooms are required to serve anyone at the risk of dying, and while states have largely adopted Medicaid, which provides substantial care to low-income individuals, remember the Republicans fought Medicaid expansion and Obamacare and all of that infrastructure tooth and nail. That's why I consider the argument above flimsy. I would like to believe that, quote, most Christians, unquote, have a head on their shoulders, but the voting patterns and the representation that they stand by in Congress speaks volumes about what they're willing to abide and does nothing to progress society on any of the points in which you were initially concerned. So I think in summation, I think basically what she's saying is that something like the delta you gave out doesn't really, I guess, fully attend to or relevant to your core points. Is that a fair?
Yeah, well, she was kind of, this person was kind of going out after both me and Kevin Wester. She was saying that, like, I didn't really give enough support to my side of the argument, but she was also, at least the way I was reading it, was they were saying that Kevin Wester was making bad arguments.
Yeah. Okay, well, what I was hoping, and maybe you could point me in the direction of it. Did you find any comments in here from genuine pro-lifers that you thought were useful or cogent and intelligent and thoughtful? Something to just, I want to give a read to the other side,
Yeah, I'd have to go back and look, mostly just because this blew up so much, and it was also a month ago.
Yeah, totally. Okay.
And like one of the things that was like a little bit hard with it was there was a lot of like not necessarily helpful comments at the beginning when I was a lot more involved with it.
Right.
But as it started going on throughout the evening, it started blowing up and had a lot more people who came in and gave a lot more coherent explanations to their side of the story.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I thought one thing worth exploring, maybe just as an attempt to give some balance here, is I think there's a larger issue at play that expands beyond abortion, and that is the idea of internal consistency of the moral paradigms of a given political party. Would you say that's an important part of what you're getting at? Is that the two positions show just an inconsistent point of view within the larger group?
Yeah, sort of, kind of. I guess that would be a good way to simplify it down.
Okay, so what I wanted to attempt was to try a reversal of this, right? And just get your thoughts. So in your post, you're saying if Republicans do not support abortion or birth control, then they should be supporting social programs to help raise children. So if I were trying to reverse that in a way, right, then I would write if Democrats support support the access to abortion or birth control. I'm sorry, if Democrats are so for social programs to help families, or they're so for creating that help, then why aren't they also more interested in defending fetuses, right? So what would you make of a reversal kind of argument like that, just to put it back on the other side?
Um, the the first thing that sort of comes to mind is that you can I can kind of support that because you can make the argument of if they're going to support the people that want to have these people can have those kids and they have the support to do that. But if they don't want to have those kids, then they have the ability to trying to think of the best way to word this exactly. The people that want to have children have the support to have that, but if they don't, they don't necessarily have to. They don't necessarily have to worry about it.
So it provides a situation wherein that choice allows people essentially to wait until they're ready to have kids, I guess.
Yeah.
And what about those people who, on that potential opposing view, to the example of like someone who was, let's say, using the other user's term, reckless, and still wants the kid and does it, basically with the idea in mind that, well, I couldn't otherwise afford it, but now the government's covering it, let's go for it.
Oh, well, I can sort of see how like some people might want to game that system, and it does kind of look bad when you look at somebody's sort of justifications for doing that, like you were talking about, where it's like, oh, hey, the government's just gonna bankroll my child. I'll have as many babies as I want now. And that can sound like a little bit shallow on the surface, but the way I kind of look at it is that can actually be sort of a good thing overall in the long term because there's been like some studies and polls done that show that like populations have sort of been stagnating or even shrinking in some places of the world because people around the world don't think they can afford to have big, large families, so they cut back on the amount of children they have.
Right.
And I think I was reading something where it's like in the distant past, it used to be like 3, 4, 5 children per family, but now it's closer to like 2 or 3, and
Yeah.
that's leading to a stagnating population. So while there might be some people who do that for just to game the system, I think in the long term it would be a benefit for the country in that case.
Gotcha. So just in the interest of a sort of demographic advantage,
Yeah.
do you think such a demographic advantage though is a relevant factor to this core moral discussion though? Like is that does that speak to the deeper issues?
Well, sort of, kind of. Like the way I sort of approach that with the way you're talking about it is that, and I think I made it in the post that I get awarded a Delta in, but it's like the Republicans' their view is, I sort of boiled it down to if they don't like, trying to think of the best way to phrase this exactly. If like we care about a child while it's inside the womb, but once it comes out, we don't care what happens to it. It's up to you to care for it. Um, but when you sort of reverse that and say that if we care for the child, if we care for a child that comes out, we don't care what you do when it's inside the womb. And I sort of feel like that's a bit
Mhm.
more logically consistent.
That's yeah. I think you said it better than I did before, but that was sort of the flip I was trying to get at. And I guess what I'm trying to do here is just make sure for listeners we're getting some balance on the topic. And so I'm not necessarily speaking my own platform here. We're just trying to like really explore the full thing. So and the implications.
Yeah.
And I think there's something else here that as far as the internal consistency within a party's system, right? Is
Mhm.
that if you're looking at the structure of the party's Democrat or Republican, right? Like up until, around the era of Roe v. Wade, it was not really a major driving political issue up until late 70s, early 80s, and it really became an issue that became a fully Republican issue because the strong there's this evolution that's happened within the parties, but the parties are like groups of, and I'm borrowing a lot from one of the courses I just took. This is from the Saller course at UCLA, but it's like parties are coalitions of interest groups, right? So you might have teachers or pro-life people or older Americans or college students. So there's all these different groups that tend to sort of find their natural homes in parties, right? And so if you've got like this coalition, and there are two positions that powerful groups within that coalition, perhaps that don't have their own overlapping things, but want to support. Like those issues may not reflect an internally coherent paradigm. So like looking at how democracy evolves, would it not be expected that a given party is going to necessarily, no matter what, end up with a lot of internal inconsistencies just by the nature of compromise that allows party formation?
Well, yeah, and that's kind of one of the things that you can sort of see with American democracy if you sort of go back throughout the years. And I think there's actually like a official term like party systems, and those sort of reference big shifts in how the two parties would respond to things. And like one of the big ones was the New Deal and the Great Depression in that era, and how they used to be, the two parties were pretty similar, but they butted heads over a couple of specific things. But over the course of 80 years from then to now, they diverged on a lot of things, and you have a huge partisan gap over pretty much every issue.
Yeah, and one of the things that's interestingly happened is that with the Reagan Revolution and like before that, a lot of Christian conservatives were not as politically powerful as they are today, and that tied in with like the abortion issue, and it really fueled a lot of what's going on the right. But what happened with a number of things is that, and I won't go through all of them, but they're like the parties used to be a little messier back in the day, and now they're actually more internally consistent than they used to be, right? So because of that, those internal consistencies, they're still not perfect, like your post talks about, but it's actually leading to more polarization. And so an interesting counterpoint to what the underlying idea that the party should be consistent is that the more consistent they are, the more their bubbles sort of harden or reify into things that can't talk to each other. And I just want to see if you had any thoughts about that.
Well, I kind of agree with that in like a 50-50 kind of sense, because what you're saying is that as these issues become more solid for people, it'll drive polarization, but that can happen in the opposite direction. You could have the parties come together on an issue of some kind, and that's essentially what compromise is. And like you can sort of break it down as we have supporters on this side that are going over this, or that are in favor of this thing, and this other party has supporters that are in favor of this side of the issue. But if we can come to a middle ground, then that can help solve the issue or find a rational middle ground. But one of the problems that I'm sort of saying with American democracy is it's sort of gone into the opposite direction with that, where they've become like so rigid that it's like, we're not going to find compromise. Instead, we're going to advocate for the strongest possible version of our platform. Yeah. So while in other like democracies where people will, this kind of thing would happen and a compromise would be found, we sort of seem to go in the opposite direction and sort of go for the strongest possible thing.
Yeah, and a lot of the trends actually predate social media. So, in some ways, the social media bubbles have enhanced the polarization issue. But even before that, going back to depending on how back you want to trace it, but some of the larger modern thrusts has happened with Newt Gingrich, essentially opting to not post chairmanships by seniority, but by his choice of loyalty, or however he wanted to do it, and so it became more difficult for middle ground Republicans to cross the aisle, and then the same happened on the other side as a result. And or like another interesting thing was that you had a switch when Johnson was in support of the Civil Rights Amendment. that essentially what used to be the Southern white South, which largely opposed that, left and joined the Republican Party. And so you have that overlap then. What used to be, that Christian conservative base was kind of 50-50 between the parties.
Yeah.
But the overlap there in the South moved a lot towards the Republican side. And you essentially had, again, like another like congealing. Like if you have a bunch of magnets on a table and some are pointed the wrong way, but over time, if you shake it, they'll end up sort of aligning up over time, right? So like
Yeah.
it'll decrease the entropy. It'll form harder, more organized things. That's sort of what's happening on both sides. And so you see just it's like, see, when I wanted in earlier years to have the parties be more internally consistent, but now I'm like, well, is that just leading us into getting into lockdown where we can't talk to each other? And I don't know. Sorry.
Not a problem.
There.
And that's definitely a solid sort of viewpoint to have on it. And I gave my 2 cents where it's like, well, that's definitely the case here in American politics, but that doesn't have to necessarily be the rule. And you can see that in other things. And like a good example of what I'm talking about would be like immigration, for example. Like early on, immigration was generally supported by both parties. And this was like back in like the late 1800s, early 1900s, that kind of time when there was a lot of immigrants coming through, and you had like the radicals. The party kind of escapes. The group kind of escapes my mind, but it's basically people that wanted to lock down immigration, so like how we have now. But they didn't necessarily have like a solid party.
Right.
And that was kind of the case up until about like 10, 20, 30 years ago when you started having a lot more immigration, and you would have politicians that would take that and turn it into a wedge issue. And that's kind of the problem that I see, is politicians looking to be able to curry favor with their base and all will turn something into a wedge issue when it doesn't necessarily have to be.
Yeah, and that's happened in a lot of issues that where it's been deliberately it's cynically used on both sides to sort of just split people apart. And these like it's weird because you have people on one side who are like, you're killing people, I don't want you to kill the people. These fetuses, I consider it a person. And then on the other side, they're like, well, like this other argument of, well, people should be free to do what they want, including with their own bodies. So therefore women should do this. And then the other side's like, well, yeah, but what about the fetus's control of its own body and its rights? And then like, so you sort of like, it's like concentric circles. It's almost like if we were delivered by the stork, there wouldn't be an issue, right?
Yeah.
But like in an idea of a society with freedoms, like, and if those rights are sacred, you have one of those entities contained within another one physically. Like, that's complicated. That's a complicated issue. And it's not, I just think I wish I would hear both sides appreciate where the other side's coming from, and just like agree that this is not an easy one and we need to talk more about it, and not to just be like the other side's bad.
Yeah, well, that's one of the things that I found interesting about this issue, is that when you look at things in aggregate, Republicans tend to be more in support of personal liberties and stuff, and Democrats tend to be more in favor of like government intervention and stuff. And on this issue in particular, it seems to like flip 180 degrees, where it's the Democrats are saying, hey, these people should be able to be free to make their decisions on what they want to do with this fetus, while the Republicans are saying like, no, the government should have the ability to come in and stop these people from doing what they're doing.
Yeah. Well, what do you make of the idea that each party actually intervenes in people's lives, but in different ways? So, for instance, Republicans tend to want more economic freedom, but less social freedom, right? And then Democrats would want more social freedom, but more government-controlled percent of the economy, however you want to tune that dial to 20, 40, 50%, whatever.
Yeah.
So is there, what was it, I guess, that made you find the Republicans as more controlling than the Democrats in that sense?
Well, sort of like what you were saying, they have polar opposite viewpoints when you look at political and economic stuff.
Mhm.
or really, I guess in this case, it's more social and economic. Um, but that was like the thing that I was sort of looking at is this sort of is a thing where they kind of both things can kind of come together, where it's both sort of a social and economic issue, because you sort of have the social and moral obligation of when does this fetus like count as a living human person, and when does it have the rights that that sort of come with being a human, and by extension, because we're talking about the United States, rights of a U.S. citizen.
Mhm.
And that's sort of like one of the bigger arguments with it, where some people are. That's sort of like a sub argument inside of this, where trying to justify um, abortion or trying to get rid of it. It's like, when does the fetus become like considered conscious and sentient and all? And some people are
Mhm.
saying that doesn't really happen until they come outside the womb and are a fully functioning person by themselves. And I've seen like other things where it's like as soon as the baby gets a heartbeat or something, which I think is like at 13 weeks or something.
Mhm.
I'm not entirely certain on that, but there's a whole bunch of like different sub arguments inside of it that sort of bounce back and forth between the social aspects and the economic aspects that the parties are polar opposites on.
And I think you do underline that a good part of this is that what people value the most here, in a sense, is is core to what democracy and liberty is, and it's I think a lot of people are going to be spending time with family at Christmas, and like Thanksgiving, there's going to be people in the room with the other point of view, and for those people listening on either side of the argument, did you have any thoughts to add on sort of advising them on maybe just stay the heck away from any of that conversation, or if it somehow comes up, how to manage it?
Um, well, and I've sort of seen this as like comments of jokes and stuff, especially of how polarized politics can be nowadays. Um, to me, like I feel like it would be the best case situation would be for the issue not to be there at all, where you can sort of have a civilized argument with people, and it doesn't break down into a shouting match and accusing the other people of being murderers and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
And that's part of the reason why I like the subreddit that we're discussing about right now. Because while there are some people that come and just make those short, quippy statements accusing you of being a terrible person, overall in the aggregate, you have a lot of people that are willing to sit down and have that conscious argument and stuff.
Right on. Well, this had to have been a very when it started exploding and going up to thousands and thousands of people or not participating but upvoting at least. Like, what were there any surprises or anything that came to you?
Um, well, I kind of backed off a little bit about like the 4 or 5 hour mark.
Mhm.
Because that's special when it started blowing up. Because I was like, it was starting to get late anyway for me. But as it was going on, I was like, wow, it is really starting to get nuts and all. And I started like slowly pulling myself out of the conversation, just seeing where other people were taking it. Because even though this was like my post and I'm the one making the argument, so like what I was talking about, where I had people underneath my delta coming and making the reverse argument and saying that no, you shouldn't have given this delta because X, Y, and Z. I sort of saw the same thing going on just sort of naturally by itself, and found it kind of interesting just to sort of step back and see what other people were saying, and sort of try to change my mind according to that, or take their arguments and incorporate that into mine and all.
Very cool. Okay, and then I have a sort of a quick little checklist of things I wanted to ask you, but and one thing I think we would really need to bring into the conversation here is just and I want to get your perspective on this without adding much, but just the idea that you and I, neither of us are female or mothers or capable of being so. What are your thoughts on the conversation happening? It's just us two guys, or what if all those top comments, and I don't know the genders of any of the people you commented, but we're also all dudes. Like, what part of the conversation do you think might be missing if, with that conspicuous, at least uniformity between you and I today, both being male, but also in the thread? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I don't want to deny that women like don't have an important role in this. They do, because ultimately that's what this whole argument is about. Should the women be be allowed or not be allowed to have the right to an abortion, all this other stuff. But also like one of the things to sort of consider is there are like some guys as well that have also had their lives affected by this thing. Like you had asked me at the beginning if there was like some sort of event that had prompted me to go on to the subreddit and discuss this. And while I didn't have that, probably are other people out there that even though they didn't directly have a child themselves as guys, they probably had a spouse or a family member or something that had a situation come up that would influence their opinions on stuff, but also give them a new perspective on things. So while I think it is important to include women in the conversation, and I wish there was more people who would give their opinions on this stuff, I do think it's also important to include the opinions of like guys who have also had this affect their lives in some case.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, my last question for you was just if you for the listeners who are pro-life out there, is there anything you'd want to leave them with from your point of view? I don't know if you want to say nice things or bad things or build a bridge or a wall, whatever. But just I want to sort of make a moment here of just something if you'd want to say anything to anyone on the pro-life side.
Well, first off, I do want to say that, like, to the people who are pro-life, like, you do have a stance and you have arguments to back it up, and that's good. I don't want to see people who just blindly support something and say that, oh, I support this just because my elected official has said this and he is infallible and he can never say something wrong. I would always appreciate somebody who can bring an argument to their fact and all. But that's also on the opposite side, where I feel like there's people that might have been pushed towards a pro-life sentiment, because you would have people on the pro-life side who make a purely ideological opinion on stuff and don't really have facts to support it, and would be in that opposite position, like what I was talking about, where it's, oh, I'm pro-life because my parents raised me that way, or my elected official said this, and that person, I believe 100% and all. I always support people who are doing their research into stuff, and if you have research on your stuff and you can present a solid argument, that's great.
All right. Well, we're well over the hour point here, and I want to wrap up soon. But was there anything else you wanted to discuss or bring up?
Not necessarily. I do want to say that I really did like having this conversation, both with you and with other people on the subreddit. It really did kind of surprise me how much it blew up, especially because I know abortion is kind of a common topic that comes up and all, but it just kind of amazed me to what extent this sort of went up and all, and like I'm just sort of amazed that even though it's not an issue I've personally had myself, it's still something that a lot of people care about and throwing their 2 cents in.
Great. Okay. Well, I feel like that's a good place to pause or stop, rather. And I just wanted to say, to everyone listening, thank you for sticking with us here on the podcast, and thank you, John, for joining us. And any last thoughts?
Nothing really. I think I've probably made my point time and time again.
Great. Okay. Well, then we'll leave it there. And anyone who's interested in checking out other episodes at changemyview.net under the podcast tab, there's links to all the episodes on multiple platforms, YouTube and many others. And thanks for listening. And we'll see you on Change My View. Everyone listening. All right. Thanks a lot. Have a good one.
Take care, everyone.